A smile lingers a fraction too long across the conference table. Nothing in the room appears hostile. Coffee cups sit untouched. Pens rest beside neatly stacked reports. Yet the air has quietly shifted. One person has stopped speaking, not because they have nothing left to say, but because something unexpected has entered the conversation. Across from them, another voice has challenged an idea without raising its volume, questioned an assumption without seeking attention, and then fallen silent. The silence, strangely, feels louder than the argument ever could. Eyes drift for confirmation. Shoulders stiffen. A joke arrives a little too late. The discussion continues, but something invisible has already fractured. That fracture rarely begins with intelligence itself. Knowledge can be admired. Talent can even be borrowed. Success can be explained away as luck, timing, or privilege. Yet every so often, someone walks into a room carrying something far more difficult to dismiss. They seem oddly unaffected by approval. Compliments neither inflate them nor criticism unravel them. They listen longer than expected. They answer only when necessary. Every attempt to provoke them seems to disappear into an emotional void. To many observers, this looks like confidence. To one particular kind of personality, it feels dangerously different. It feels like losing control over a game no one admitted was being played. Power often survives by remaining unnoticed. It prefers subtle exchanges over dramatic confrontations. A raised eyebrow. An interrupted sentence. A carefully timed compliment that quietly establishes superiority. A question disguised as concern. None of these moments attracts attention on their own. Together, they create invisible hierarchies that shape families, friendships, workplaces, and relationships. Most people participate without recognizing the rules. The ones who do recognize them become difficult to predict. And unpredictability has a peculiar effect on those who rely on psychological dominance. The common belief is that narcissistic personalities crave admiration because they think too highly of themselves. That explanation feels satisfying because it is simple. Simplicity, however, has a habit of hiding the most important details. Beneath exaggerated confidence often lies something surprisingly fragile, not ordinary insecurity, but an identity that survives almost entirely through external reflection. Like an actor who forgets where the performance ends, the carefully crafted image becomes more valuable than the person behind it. Every interaction becomes another stage. Every conversation becomes another audition. Every relationship quietly asks the same question: will you help protect the character I've created? This is where intelligence becomes misunderstood. Raw intelligence is not threatening. Encyclopedic knowledge can actually be useful. Highly accomplished people are frequently welcomed, praised, even recruited into these psychological systems, provided their abilities strengthen someone else's image. The danger emerges only when intelligence carries something else alongside it. Perception. The ability to notice contradictions without announcing them. The patience to observe behavior instead of accepting appearances. A mind that quietly compares actions with intentions instead of accepting polished narratives at face value. That kind of perception behaves like a mirror no one agreed to stand in front of. Nothing has to be said aloud. Exposure often happens through silence. A fabricated story receives no admiration. An exaggerated achievement earns only polite acknowledgement. A manipulative compliment fails to create obligation. The expected emotional response never arrives. For a personality built around controlling impressions, this absence feels deeply unsettling. Not because they have been attacked, but because their usual methods have suddenly stopped producing predictable results. Control depends less on strength than on certainty. Predictable people are remarkably easy to influence. Praise them and they move closer. Shame them and they retreat. Exclude them and they seek acceptance. Include them and they become loyal. Every reaction becomes another piece of information, another adjustment in an invisible strategy. Yet emotionally grounded individuals introduce a variable that cannot easily be calculated. They may appreciate praise without becoming dependent on it. They may hear criticism without allowing it to define them. Their decisions appear strangely disconnected from the emotional pressures surrounding them. For someone accustomed to directing emotional traffic, this feels like trying to steer a vehicle whose wheels no longer touch the road. Notice how quickly conversations change around such people. A harmless disagreement suddenly becomes personal. A forgotten mistake is unexpectedly revived. Someone begins speaking over them with unusual confidence. Credit quietly shifts elsewhere. Small acts of exclusion begin appearing where none existed before. Invitations become selective. Rumors acquire just enough ambiguity to remain believable. None of these behaviors announce themselves as hostility. They emerge gradually, disguised as coincidence. To outsiders, everything appears normal. Beneath the surface, an invisible contest has already begun. Ironically, the individual attracting this tension frequently has no idea why. Their attention remains fixed on solving problems rather than navigating status. They mistake manipulation for misunderstanding. They assume others share the same interest in clarity that they do. By the time they recognize the emotional undercurrents, alliances have quietly formed around perceptions rather than facts. Truth, in these moments, becomes less influential than narrative. Whoever controls the emotional story often controls the room. This reveals one of the strangest paradoxes of human behavior. Intelligence alone does not destabilize fragile personalities. Accuracy does not either. The more serious threat is independence. A person who cannot be emotionally purchased becomes difficult to psychologically predict. They listen without surrendering judgment. They cooperate without surrendering identity. They remain calm where others instinctively perform. Every encounter silently communicates a message no words could express. Your version of reality is not the only one available here. For someone whose sense of self depends upon constant validation, that message lands like an invisible earthquake. Because the greatest threat to a carefully constructed illusion has never been criticism. It has always been quiet recognition. And recognition has a peculiar habit of changing the behavior of everyone in the room, even before a single accusation is spoken. Recognition rarely announces itself with confrontation. It arrives in quieter ways. A delayed response to flattery. A refusal to compete for attention. An uncomfortable pause after an exaggerated story. The narcissistic mind is constantly reading these tiny signals, searching for reassurance that the image it projects is still being accepted. When that reassurance disappears, something deeper than disappointment begins to stir. The polished exterior remains intact, but internally, uncertainty spreads with surprising speed. The script has changed, and no one handed them the new lines. The human brain is built to predict outcomes. Every familiar interaction becomes a shortcut, allowing us to anticipate reactions before they happen. For someone whose identity depends heavily on controlling social perception, those predictions become emotional survival. Compliment someone, expect admiration in return. Apply subtle guilt, expect compliance. Display confidence, expect authority. Yet emotionally secure, perceptive individuals interrupt this pattern. Their responses refuse to follow the expected sequence. They acknowledge praise without becoming attached to it. They question assumptions without sounding defensive. They decline manipulation without appearing hostile. Deep inside the brain, this creates what neuroscientists call a prediction error, a moment when reality refuses to match expectation. The prefrontal cortex begins searching for explanations while the amygdala quietly interprets uncertainty as danger. No physical threat exists, yet the emotional alarm has already sounded. That reaction explains why manipulation often becomes more sophisticated rather than more obvious. Direct control has failed, so indirect control begins. A harmless joke suddenly carries an edge. A compliment arrives wrapped around subtle criticism. Others are quietly recruited into conversations that never mention the real issue. The goal is no longer to dominate openly. It becomes restoring psychological certainty. If the independent person can be made to doubt themselves, apologize unnecessarily, compete for approval, or react emotionally, the familiar pattern returns. Order is restored. The invisible hierarchy survives another day. Few places reveal this dynamic more clearly than the modern workplace. A meeting begins with routine discussion. An experienced manager presents an ambitious proposal, speaking with practiced certainty. Halfway through the conversation, someone calmly asks a single question, not to embarrass, but to understand. The room grows unusually still. The question exposes a missing assumption. Nothing dramatic happens. The manager smiles politely, promises to revisit the numbers, and moves on. Days later, that employee finds themselves excluded from an important project. Their ideas begin receiving less acknowledgement. Another colleague suddenly takes credit for work everyone remembers differently. Officially, nothing is wrong. Unofficially, equilibrium is being restored. The same pattern quietly unfolds inside friendships. One person constantly positions themselves as the source of wisdom, humor, or emotional authority. The group unconsciously accepts the arrangement because it feels familiar. Then someone new arrives. Not louder, not more charismatic, simply less interested in competing. Conversations naturally drift toward them because they ask thoughtful questions instead of telling impressive stories. They laugh easily without demanding attention. They admit uncertainty without losing confidence. Gradually, admiration begins shifting without anyone deciding it should. For a personality invested in social status, this silent redistribution of attention feels less like rejection and more like erasure. Romantic relationships reveal an even darker version of the same struggle. Control initially disguises itself as devotion. Endless messages become concern. Jealousy becomes love. Monitoring becomes protection. The relationship feels intensely emotional because every disagreement threatens the carefully constructed identity one partner depends upon. Then something changes. The other person begins setting quiet boundaries. They stop explaining every decision. They no longer rush to repair every conflict. Their emotional center slowly moves inward instead of outward. Arguments that once produced panic now end with calm silence. Nothing terrifies psychological control more than realizing emotional dependence has quietly disappeared. Family gatherings carry their own invisible choreography. Every relative already knows the unwritten roles. One person keeps the peace. Another seeks approval. Someone else dominates every conversation. Then an adult child returns after years away, no longer reacting to old provocations. The sarcastic remarks receive no defensive reply. The guilt no longer creates immediate obedience. The familiar buttons still exist, but they no longer work. Around the dinner table, confusion spreads before irritation takes its place. Families rarely resist change because change is wrong. They resist because predictability has disappeared. Social media amplifies these dynamics in ways previous generations never experienced. Carefully edited lives compete for attention measured in numbers visible to everyone. Validation becomes immediate, public, and addictive. Within that environment, authenticity behaves almost like a disruption. Someone who shares thoughtfully without chasing approval, who disappears without announcing it, who refuses to build an identity around constant admiration, quietly breaks the algorithm of emotional dependence. Visibility no longer guarantees influence. Performance no longer guarantees respect. Behind every polished image lies the uncomfortable possibility that someone else has stopped needing the audience altogether. Perhaps the greatest irony is that many perceptive people never recognize the influence they have. They assume conflict grows from misunderstanding rather than silent comparison. They continue treating everyone with ordinary respect, unaware that their emotional independence has become an unintended mirror. That mirror reflects something difficult to escape. Not failure. Not weakness. Exposure. It reveals the exhausting effort required to maintain an identity built almost entirely on external validation. No accusation is necessary because reality begins speaking for itself. This may explain why authenticity feels strangely powerful despite rarely demanding attention. Authentic people are difficult to manipulate because they spend less energy protecting an image. Their thoughts can change without threatening who they are. Their mistakes become information instead of humiliation. Their self-worth survives disagreement because it was never built entirely from agreement in the first place. That flexibility creates psychological stability. Ironically, stability often appears intimidating to those whose emotional world depends on constant reinforcement. Beneath every struggle for dominance lies a simpler human need, the need to feel real. Some people search for that feeling through admiration. Others search through achievement, relationships, influence, or control. Yet none of those reflections remain stable for long because reflections always depend on someone else standing nearby. Remove the audience, and the image begins to fade. Build an identity from within, and silence no longer feels like abandonment. It becomes space. Perhaps that is why the deepest conflicts between perceptive minds and narcissistic personalities rarely end with a dramatic confrontation. More often, they dissolve into distance. One person keeps searching for mirrors. The other quietly stops providing one. Nothing spectacular happens. No final argument. No perfect victory. Just an invisible shift that leaves one individual chasing recognition while the other continues walking without looking back. Long after names are forgotten and conversations disappear into memory, one unsettling thought remains. The greatest threat to an illusion has never been intelligence itself. It has always been the quiet presence of someone who no longer mistakes performance for identity. And for a person living behind a mask, nothing is more frightening than meeting someone who can see the face without ever asking for it.